Faith Lewis thought surviving Lee Min-ho's world meant she was finally in control. She wasn't, because in the underworld, the moment you think you're equal is the moment they remind you who owns the room. 6 months after stepping deeper into Lee's empire, Faith would discover a truth no one warns you about. Loyalty isn't protection. Closeness isn't safety, and power comes with humiliating costs you don't see until it's too late. What happened behind closed doors that night didn't leave bruises, it left leverage. And once someone has leverage over you, there's no walking away, only obedience or consequences. If you made it through Part 1 believing Faith was rising beside a mafia boss, Part 2 reveals the moment she realized she was never rising at all. She was being cornered. And this time, there's no exit. Before we continue, subscribe now because this story doesn't get safer, it gets worse. Now, let's continue. Faith Lewis had learned to sleep with one eye open, not figuratively, literally. Her body had adapted to the compound's rhythm of violence, training itself to wake at footsteps that were too heavy, voices that carried urgency, the specific click of weapons being loaded in nearby rooms. At 44 years old, she'd developed the hyper-vigilance of a soldier, the constant alertness that never truly allowed rest. It had been 18 months since that first phone call. 18 months since she'd walked away from her suffocating hospital job into Lee Min-ho's dangerous world. 18 months of becoming someone she barely recognized. The woman who looked back at her from the bathroom mirror each morning wore expensive clothes tailored perfectly to her body. Her natural hair was styled by professionals who came to the compound weekly. Her skin glowed from facials and treatments she'd never been able to afford before. She looked successful, powerful, transformed, but her eyes told a different story. They held shadows that expensive makeup couldn't quite cover, the kind of darkness that came from watching men die, from making impossible choices, from carrying secrets that weighed more than flesh ever could. "You're up early?" Lee's voice came from the doorway of their shared bedroom, rough with sleep. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist with familiar ease, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both studied her reflection. They'd been lovers for 14 months now. The surgery had been successful. Everything worked exactly as it should, better than before, according to Lee. Their physical relationship was passionate, sometimes tender, occasionally desperate in the way of people who lived constantly with death's proximity. But lately, Faith had noticed something shifting. Not in Lee's desire for her, that remained constant, almost possessive, in herself. In how she felt when his hands touched her skin, when his lips found hers in the dark. There was a hollowness now where joy should live, a disconnection that frightened her more than any threat to her physical safety. "You're up early," she said, her voice neutral. "Big meeting today with the Taiwanese delegation." Lee's arms tightened around her. "You don't have to attend if you're uncomfortable. Marcus can handle the negotiations. I'm your strategic advisor. Of course I'm attending." Faith kept her tone professional, but inside something twisted. When had she started thinking of herself this way? When had strategic advisor to a criminal organization become her identity instead of nurse or healer or even just Faith? Lee studied her reflection with those dark, assessing eyes that missed nothing. "You've been distant lately. For weeks now. What's wrong?" "Everything. Nothing. I don't know anymore." "I'm fine," Faith lied, the words automatic. "Just tired." She'd become an excellent liar, another skill she'd developed in Lee's world right alongside tactical planning and emergency trauma care during firefights. She lied to Lee about her growing doubts. She lied to Eleanor about the nightmares that left her gasping awake at 3 a.m. She lied to herself about whether this life was sustainable, whether the person she'd become was who she wanted to be. The meeting with the Taiwanese delegation started at 10 a.m. sharp in the compound's conference room, a space that looked more like a corporate boardroom than anything associated with organized crime. Sleek table, comfortable chairs, technology for presentations, the veneer of civilization over violence. Faith sat at Lee's right hand, her tablet open with detailed notes on the proposed partnership. The Taiwanese wanted to use Lee's distribution networks for their synthetic drug operations. In exchange, they'd provide weapons and intelligence on rival organizations. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that would expand Lee's power significantly while diversifying his revenue streams. The words in her notes might as well have been describing stock trades or marketing strategies. Clinical, sanitized, removing all human cost from the equation. Chen Wei, the Taiwanese representative, smiled at Faith with predatory interest.
Ms. Lewis, your reputation precedes you. I hear you're quite brilliant at strategic analysis. I do my job, Faith replied evenly, ignoring the way his eyes lingered on her body. More than that, I think. Chen leaned forward. Lee is lucky to have found such a capable partner. Intelligence and beauty, a rare combination. Faith had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times now. Men in Lee's world sizing her up, trying to determine if she was genuinely powerful or merely decorative, trying to figure out if they could use her, manipulate her, turn her against Lee for their own advantage. She'd learned to navigate these interactions with cool professionalism that revealed nothing. Another mask, another layer of protection between her true self and the world she'd chosen. The proposed distribution network has some vulnerabilities, Faith said, redirecting the conversation firmly back to business. She pulled up a map on the large screen. Here, and here, these checkpoints are exposed to law enforcement interdiction. I suggest routing through these alternate channels instead. They're more secure, less monitored, and reduce your exposure by approximately 40%. She was advising criminals on how to traffic drugs more efficiently. The realization hit her suddenly, making her stomach turn. When had this become normal? When had she stopped feeling the weight of these decisions? Chen's smile widened with genuine appreciation. Excellent analysis. I see why Lee values you so highly. The meeting continued for 3 more hours. Faith presented detailed logistics plans, risk assessments, contingency protocols. She was good at this work, frighteningly good. Her medical background, her ability to see patterns and predict outcomes, her strategic thinking, all of it translated perfectly to this world. That was the problem. She fit too well. She'd found a place where her skills were valued, where her intelligence was recognized, where she had real power and influence. But the cost was her soul, piece by piece. After the Taiwanese delegation left, Lee pulled her into his office, his expression pleased. That was brilliant work. Chen was impressed. They're going to agree to our terms. This partnership will double our revenue within 6 months. Good, Faith said automatically. Lee's pleasure faded, replaced by concern. Faith, talk to me. Really talk to me. Something's been wrong for weeks now. Is it us? Did I do something? Say something? How could she explain it to him when she barely understood it herself? How could she tell him that she was drowning in the life she'd chosen? That every day she felt herself becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone she wasn't sure she could live with? I killed someone, Faith said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Lee froze. What? 3 weeks ago, during the Volkov ambush. Faith's voice was flat, emotionless, the only way she could get the words out. One of their men got past your perimeter. He came at me while I was treating wounded. I had a scalpel in my hand from emergency surgery. I didn't think, I just moved, cut his femoral artery. He bled out in 90 seconds. She'd saved that memory up, pushed it down deep where she didn't have to examine it, but it kept surfacing at random moments, while eating breakfast, while reviewing financial reports, while lying next to Lee in the dark. The feeling of her hand moving, the resistance of flesh, the hot spray of arterial blood, the man's eyes going wide with shock and then empty. That was self-defense, Lee, said Lee firmly. He would have killed you. I know. Logically, I know that, Faith said. Looking at her hands, they were steady now, no trace of the blood that had covered them. But I'm a nurse, Lee. I took an oath. First, do no harm. I spent 15 years of my life learning to save people, and now I'm advising drug traffickers and killing men with surgical precision. What does that make me?" Chen crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "It makes you a survivor. It makes you someone who refused to let the world break her, who found power in a place that valued her. Or it makes me someone who sold her principles for money and safety." The words tasted bitter. Someone who pretended this was empowerment when really it was just giving up, taking the easy path instead of fighting to change the systems that failed me. "There is nothing easy about this life," Lee said, his voice hard now. "You've survived assassination attempts, treated gunshot wounds under fire, made decisions that saved lives and ended others. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known." "Strong," Faith repeated. The word felt hollow. "Is that what we're calling it? Because some days it feels more like broken, like I've fractured into so many pieces trying to fit this life that I can't remember what the original shape was supposed to be." Lee's jaw tightened. "If you want out, tell me now. I'll arrange safe passage, new identity, money to start over anywhere in the world. I won't stop you." The offer hung between them, genuine and terrifying, because part of Faith did want out, desperately, wanted to reclaim some piece of who she'd been before, but another part knew it was too late. She'd seen too much, done too much, become too complicit. There was no going back to simple nurse Faith who treated patients and went home to an empty apartment. That woman was dead. She'd died the moment Faith got in that black Mercedes 18 months ago. "I don't know what I want anymore," Faith admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "That's the problem. I don't know who I am without this now." Before Lee could respond, his phone rang sharply. He answered, listened, his expression darkening moment by moment. When he hung up, all trace of their intimate conversation had vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of a man at war. "Volkov's moving against us. Major offensive. He's hit 3 of our warehouses simultaneously, killed 15 men and seized nearly 5 million in product and cash. This is war. Full war." Lee was already moving, pulling weapons from hidden compartments, checking ammunition. "I need you at the command center. We're mobilizing everything." And just like that, Faith was pulled back in. Because men were dying. Because Lee needed her strategic mind. Because this was her life now, for better or worse, and she'd made her choice 18 months ago, even if she was only now understanding the full cost. She followed Lee to the command center, her doubts pushed aside by necessity. There would be time for existential crisis later. Right now, people needed her skills to survive. The war with Anatoly Volkov had been simmering for months, occasional skirmishes and provocations that both sides had managed to contain, but now it had erupted into full conflict, the kind that would reshape Lagos's criminal landscape or end with one organization completely destroyed. Faith spent the next 72 hours in the command center, functioning on caffeine and adrenaline. She coordinated medical teams for wounded, analyzed Volkov's attack patterns to predict his next moves, identified vulnerabilities in his supply chain they could exploit. She barely slept, barely ate, just worked with mechanical efficiency, her doubts buried under the immediate demands of survival. On the 3rd day, Eleanor found her staring at a map covered in red marks, each one representing a death in this conflict. 17 of Lee's men so far. Unknown casualties on Volkov's side, though intelligence suggested at least 20. "You need rest," Eleanor said gently. "You're running yourself into the ground." "We're losing," Faith replied, her voice hollow. "Volkov's moving faster than we anticipated. He's got military precision. These aren't just gang tactics. Someone's advising him, someone with serious training." Eleanor sat beside her, studying the map. "Lee wants to hit Volkov directly, decapitate the organization by killing him personally. That's a mistake. Too risky. If Lee dies, this organization collapses, and everyone here becomes a target for Volkov's revenge." Faith's strategic mind worked through scenarios automatically. "We need to fracture his support structure, turn his allies against him, make him vulnerable before committing to direct confrontation. Can you do that?" Faith looked at the older woman, seeing genuine worry in Eleanor's eyes. Not just for the organization, for Faith herself. Eleanor had become something like a friend over these months, one of the few people in this world who seemed to see Faith as fully human rather than just an asset. "I can do it," Faith said. "But Eleanor, what have I become? I'm sitting here planning how to destroy a man's organization, how to isolate him so Lee can kill him more easily. This isn't strategy. It's murder. Premeditated, calculated murder." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you know why I've stayed with this family for 30 years? Why I didn't leave after seeing things that would horrify most people?" Faith shook her head. "Because I made a choice too. Just like you did. I chose survival, security, a place where I mattered. And yes, that choice came with costs, moral compromises, things that keep me awake some nights." Eleanor's voice was sad but firm. "But I also chose loyalty, community, protecting people I care about. The world isn't simple, Faith. It's heroes and villains. It's complicated people making impossible choices in difficult circumstances." "That sounds like rationalization." "Maybe it is," Eleanor smiled without humor. "Or maybe it's just acceptance. Accepting that we're all flawed, that purity is a luxury most people can't afford, that sometimes you have to make choices between bad options and worse ones." Faith wanted to argue, wanted to cling to some sense of moral clarity, but she was too tired, and the words rang too true. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with it. "I'll develop the plan to isolate Volkov," she said finally. "Give me 6 hours." The plan Faith developed was elegant in its cruelty. She identified 3 key allies supporting Volkov's operations: a weapons supplier, a corrupt police chief, and a shipping magnate who moved Volkov's product through legitimate channels. Each one had vulnerabilities she could exploit. The weapons supplier had a gambling addiction and owed money to a network of bookmakers that Lee had connections with. Faith arranged for those debts to be called in simultaneously, creating immediate financial pressure. When the supplier couldn't pay, Lee's people offered a solution: betray Volkov's upcoming shipments in exchange for debt forgiveness. The corrupt police chief had a mistress he was hiding from his wife and his superiors. Faith obtained photographs through Lee's surveillance network and threatened exposure unless the chief provided intelligence on Volkov's protected locations and scheduled police raids to coincide with Volkov's operations. The shipping magnate's daughter was attending university abroad. Faith didn't threaten the girl. That crossed a line she wouldn't breach, but she made it clear through intermediaries that her father's business dealings with Volkov could result in international investigations that might complicate the daughter's visa status and future career prospects. The magnate decided his daughter's future was more important than his alliance with Volkov. Within 2 weeks, Volkov's support structure was crumbling. His weapons shipments were seized. His safe houses were raided. His distribution network was disrupted. He was bleeding money and men, isolated and desperate. Faith watched it all happen from the command center, seeing her strategic planning manifest in real consequences. Men were arrested, organizations collapsed, lives were destroyed, all because of decisions she'd made, connections she'd drawn, vulnerabilities she'd identified and exploited. "It's working perfectly," Lee said, studying the intelligence reports with satisfaction. "Volkov's scrambling. He's down to maybe 15 loyal men. Another week and we can move against him directly with minimal risk." "Good," Faith said, the word automatic. But inside, something was screaming. She'd done this. She'd orchestrated the destruction of people's lives with the same clinical precision she'd once used to save them. The weapons supplier had attempted suicide when his debts were called. He'd survived, but barely. The police chief's marriage had imploded publicly. The shipping magnate had lost his business entirely, ruined. These weren't just strategic moves on a board. They were human beings whose lives she'd shattered because they stood between Lee and victory. That night, Faith stood on the compound's balcony, staring at Lagos stretched out below. The city looked beautiful from here, lights glittering like stars, the ocean a dark expanse beyond. You couldn't see the poverty, the suffering, the violence from this height. Everything looked clean, simple, Beautiful. You're thinking too much again, Lee joined her, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He offered her one, and she took it automatically. Someone has to think, she replied. Someone has to remember that those red marks on our maps are actual people, actual lives. I know that. Lee's voice held an edge. I've never forgotten it. Every decision I make, I understand the cost. But this is my world, Faith. This is how survival works here. If I show weakness, if I hesitate, my people die. You die. Everyone I'm responsible for becomes a target. I understand the logic. Intellectually, I understand it perfectly. Faith sipped her wine, the taste bitter on her tongue. But understanding doesn't make it easier, doesn't make me feel less like I've lost something essential. Your innocence? Lee's laugh was harsh. You lost that 18 months ago when you got in that car, when you chose this life. You can't have it both ways, Faith. You can't have the power, the safety, the respect this life gives you and still keep your hands clean. That's not how reality works. Maybe I don't want power if this is the cost. The words came out before Faith could stop them. Maybe I want to be someone who doesn't strategize how to destroy people's lives before breakfast. Lee's expression shuddered, becoming cold. Then leave. I mean it. I'll make the arrangements tomorrow. New identity, money, safe passage. You can start over. As what? Faith turned to face him fully. As a nurse who abandoned her oath and lived as a criminal advisor for 2 years? As someone who killed a man and helped orchestrate the destruction of how many lives now? Who would I even be if I left? Someone free of this life. Someone who could rebuild on her own terms. The offer was genuine. Faith could see that in Lee's eyes. He would let her go, would ensure her safety, would give her the resources to start over, but he couldn't give her back the woman she'd been, couldn't erase the knowledge she now carried, the skills she'd developed, the moral compromises she'd made. That woman was gone forever. I need time, Faith said finally. Time to think without crisis, without immediate threats. Time to figure out who I want to be if I stay, or who I could become if I go. Lee nodded slowly. After Volkov, once this immediate threat is neutralized, you can have whatever time you need. But Faith, he reached out, cupping her face gently. I love you. However you choose, whatever you decide, I love you. That doesn't change. Faith closed her eyes against sudden tears. Lee loved her. She believed that. But love in his world came with chains. Golden chains. Comfortable chains. But chains nonetheless. And she was starting to understand that love wasn't always enough. Act 2. The Price of Loyalty. The attack on Volkov's headquarters happened on a Tuesday. Lee had assembled his best fighters, 30 men armed with military-grade weapons, wearing tactical gear, moving with practiced precision. It was meant to be surgical. Get in, kill Volkov and his remaining lieutenants, get out. Decapitate the organization cleanly and end the war. Faith wasn't supposed to be there. Lee had explicitly ordered her to stay at the compound where it was safe, where she could coordinate from the command center without direct exposure to danger. She went anyway, not because she wanted to fight. She didn't, but because she'd learned that staying safe while others died for decisions she'd helped make was a special kind of cowardice. If her strategic planning sent men into battle, the least she could do was be there to treat them when they were wounded. She set up a mobile medical station 3 blocks from Volkov's location, a converted delivery van stocked with emergency supplies. 2 of Lee's men stayed with her as protection, young fighters named David and Jin, both barely 25, both nervous about the upcoming assault. You shouldn't be here, Dr. Lewis, David said, checking his weapon for the 3rd time. It's too dangerous. Everywhere's dangerous in this life, Faith replied, organizing her medical supplies with practiced efficiency. At least here I can be useful. The assault began at 10 p.m. sharp. Faith heard it from blocks away. Gunfire, explosions, screams. She waited with her supplies, her hands steady despite her hammering heart, ready for whatever casualties came. The first wounded arrived within minutes, a fighter with a through-and-through gunshot to his shoulder. Faith worked quickly, packing the wound, starting an IV, administering antibiotics and pain medication. He was lucky. The bullet had missed major vessels. Then more wounded came. A sucking chest wound that Faith sealed with an emergency valve, a shattered leg from an explosion that required emergency tourniquet and aggressive fluid resuscitation, burns, lacerations, a head injury that made her deeply concerned about intracranial bleeding. She worked without stopping, her medical training taking over completely. In these moments, she wasn't a criminal advisor or a murderer or someone questioning her moral foundations. She was a nurse doing what nurses did, saving lives regardless of who those lives belonged to. "Boss is down!" someone screamed from outside. "Lee's hit! We need the doc now!" Faith's heart stopped. Then she was moving, grabbing her trauma bag, running toward the chaos despite David trying to stop her. She couldn't let Lee die. Whatever doubts she had about this life, whatever questions plagued her about who she'd become, she couldn't lose him. She found him in an alley 2 blocks from Volkov's headquarters, surrounded by his men, blood spreading across his abdomen in a way that made Faith's stomach drop. Abdominal gunshot wound, potentially catastrophic internal bleeding. "Get him in the van, now!" Faith ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos with authority. Men obeyed immediately, lifting Lee carefully, moving quickly but steadily. In the van, Faith cut away Lee's tactical vest and shirt, exposing the wound. High abdomen, left side, similar location to his previous injury but slightly different angle. The bullet had entered but not exited, still inside, potentially causing massive damage. "Lee, stay with me." Faith started an IV line with practiced precision despite the moving vehicle. "I need you conscious. Tell me where else you're hurt." "Just the abdomen." Lee's voice was tight with pain but still coherent. "Faith, Volkov's dead. We got him. It's over." "Good. Great. Now shut up and let me work." Faith packed the wound to control external bleeding, knowing the real danger was what she couldn't see, internal bleeding that could kill him before they reached proper surgical facilities. Dr. Raj Malhotra had remained on retainer, available for emergencies exactly like this. He met them at a private clinic Lee's organization maintained for situations where hospitals asked too many questions. They wheeled Lee directly into surgery while Faith scrubbed in to assist. The surgery took 7 hours. The bullet had nicked Lee's intestine and caused significant internal bleeding, but miraculously had missed major vessels. Raj repaired the damage with meticulous care while Faith assisted, her hands steady even as her mind screamed with fear. When it was over, when Lee was stable and sleeping under post-operative sedation, Faith finally let herself collapse in a chair outside the recovery room. Her scrubs were soaked with his blood. Her hands trembled now that the crisis had passed. She'd come so close to losing him, not just her lover, but her anchor in this impossible life. Eleanor found her there an hour later, still in bloody scrubs, staring at nothing. "He's going to be fine," Eleanor said, sitting beside her. "You saved his life, again." "What's the point?" Faith's voice was hollow. "I save his life so he can continue running a criminal empire, so more men can die in his wars, so I can continue making moral compromises until there's nothing left of the person I used to be? Faith, Volkov's dead. The war's over. We won." The words tasted like ash. "And all I can think about is what this victory cost. The weapons supplier who tried to kill himself, the police chief whose family was destroyed, the shipping magnate who lost everything, all the men who died on both sides for what? Territory? Money? Pride?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. The costs are enormous. probably unconscionable from any moral framework that values human life equally. But Faith, you need to understand something important. These men would have destroyed each other regardless of your involvement. Volkov declared war months before you developed any strategy. Your planning minimized casualties, ended the conflict faster, saved lives, including Lee's. That's still rationalization. Faith looked at the older woman. I keep trying to tell myself that I'm minimizing harm, that someone else would do worse, that this is the best of bad options. But Eleanor, when does that stop being true? When does it become just an excuse I tell myself so I can sleep at night? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. That's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. I can tell you what I believe. You're a good person in an impossible situation, trying to do the least harm possible while protecting people you care about. Whether that's enough, only you can decide. Faith stood abruptly. I need to clean up, check on the other wounded, write post-operative protocols for Lee's recovery. Faith, you've been awake for nearly 36 hours. You need rest. I'll rest when everyone's stable. Faith walked away, using work to avoid the questions that were eating her alive from the inside out. Lee recovered slowly over the next 3 weeks. Faith managed his care with the same meticulous attention she'd given his first major surgery, monitoring his vitals, managing his pain medications, ensuring proper wound healing. She was an excellent nurse, had always been an excellent nurse. That, at least, hadn't changed. But something between them had shifted. A distance Faith couldn't quite name or bridge. They talked less. Their physical intimacy felt mechanical, performed rather than passionate. Faith caught Lee watching her sometimes with confusion and concern, clearly sensing the change but not understanding its source. How could she explain it when she barely understood it herself? On the 4th week of his recovery, Lee was finally strong enough to return to work from his office. Faith attended the first major meeting of his restructured organization, a celebration, really, of their victory over Volkov and consolidation of power. The conference room was full of Lee's lieutenants, all looking prosperous and satisfied. The war had been costly, but ultimately successful. They'd absorbed most of Volkov's territory and assets. Lee's organization was now the dominant criminal power in Lagos. We've emerged stronger, Lee said, addressing the room with the quiet authority that made men follow him. The Volkov organization is finished. We've secured major distribution networks, weapons suppliers, and political protections. Our revenue projections for next year show a 40% increase. Applause, celebration, men congratulating each other on successful warfare. Faith listened with growing numbness. They were talking about criminal expansion like it was a corporate merger, discussing murder and drug distribution like market analysis, celebrating victory built on corpses and shattered lives. And she was part of it. Not incidentally or reluctantly, she'd been essential to this victory. Her strategic planning made it possible. Faith, Lee's voice pulled her back to the present. Share your analysis of our expanded operations. She stood automatically, pulling up her presentation on the screen. She'd prepared this yesterday, detailed breakdowns of their new territory, optimal distribution strategies, risk assessments for their expanded operations, efficient, clinical, devastating. We now control 70% of Lagos's synthetic drug market, Faith heard herself saying, her voice professional and distant. With Volkov's former shipping networks integrated into our operations, we can expand into neighboring countries within 6 months. Revenue projections are conservative at $40 million annually, potentially reaching $60 million if we optimize distribution and minimize law enforcement interdiction. The men in the room listened attentively, taking notes, asking strategic questions. Faith answered each one with precision, her mind working through logistics and calculations automatically. $60 million annually, from drugs that would destroy lives, tear apart families, contribute to the poverty and suffering she could see from the compound's balcony every night. $60 million built on human misery, and she was helping them achieve it. The realization hit Faith with physical force, making her stumble slightly mid-presentation. Lee noticed immediately, his expression concerned, but she recovered quickly, finishing her analysis with professional competence. When the meeting ended, when the men filed out congratulating each other, Faith remained sitting, staring at the presentation still displayed on the screen. Charts, graphs, market analysis, human suffering reduced to percentages and profit margins. "Are you all right?" Lee approached, sitting beside her. "You seemed off during the presentation." "I'm fine." The automatic lie. She was getting so good at lying. "Faith." Lee took her hand gently. "The war's over. Volkov's gone. You can relax now. Take time for yourself. We're safe." Safe. The word was laughable. She'd never been less safe. Not physically, but spiritually, morally. She was in more danger than she'd ever been in her life because the danger came from inside, from the person she'd become. "Lee, do you ever think about the people affected by what we do?" The question came out before Faith could stop it. "The families torn apart by the drugs we distribute, the children who lose parents to violence or addiction, the communities destroyed by the operations we run." Lee's expression hardened slightly. "I think about them more than you know. But Faith, this world exists whether I participate or not. The drugs will be distributed regardless. The violence will happen regardless. At least this way I control it. I minimize the worst excesses. I have rules. No business with human trafficking, no involvement with children, no unnecessary civilian casualties." Those are very low bars for morality. Maybe they are, Lee's voice was firm, but they're the bars available in this world. I didn't create this system, Faith. I'm just surviving within it as best I can while protecting the people I'm responsible for. "And what about me?" Faith pulled her hand away. "What am I protecting? What am I surviving for? I walked away from my oath as a nurse. I've helped orchestrate violence and destruction. I've become complicit in operations that cause massive human suffering. For what? Safety? Money? A sense of belonging? For love." Lee's voice softened. "For building something meaningful with someone who sees you, values you, respects you completely. For having power and agency after a lifetime of being powerless and dismissed. Those aren't small things, Faith." "No," Faith agreed, her voice breaking slightly. "They're not small things. That's what makes this so hard. Because you do see me, you do value me, and I do have more power and respect here than I ever had before. But the cost, Lee, the cost is my humanity. The cost is becoming someone I can't recognize, someone I'm not sure I want to be." Lee was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What do you want me to say? That I'll change my entire organization for you? Become legitimate? Walk away from the only life I know, leaving everyone who depends on me vulnerable? I can't do that, Faith. This is who I am." "I know." And that was the tragedy of it. Lee was exactly who he'd always been. A criminal, yes, but one with principles and genuine care for his people. He hadn't lied or deceived her. She'd walked into his world with open eyes, chosen this path voluntarily. The problem wasn't Lee, it was her. She'd thought she could be two people, the nurse who saved lives and the strategic advisor who ended them, the moral person and the pragmatic survivor. But you couldn't split yourself that way indefinitely. Eventually, you had to choose which version was real. "I need time," Faith said finally. "Real time, not a few hours or a day. I need to step back from active operations, figure out who I want to be going forward." Lee's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "How much time?" "I don't know. Weeks? Months? As long as it takes? Will you stay here, in the compound?" Faith shook her head. "I can't think clearly here. Everything here is wrapped up in us, in this life. I need distance to gain perspective." "Where will you go?" Lee's voice was carefully controlled, but Faith could hear the pain underneath. "I don't know yet. Maybe back to nursing. Maybe somewhere completely different. I just know I can't keep doing this. Can't keep being strategic advisor to an organization whose core activities violate everything I once believed about helping people." Lee stood, his movements stiff, partially from his still healing injury, partially from emotional pain. "I won't stop you. I promised you that from the beginning. But Faith,
I love you. That doesn't change regardless of what you choose. I know. Faith stood, facing him. And I love you too. That's what makes this unbearable, because love isn't enough if it requires me to destroy myself to stay. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other across a divide that felt suddenly impassable. Two people who cared deeply for each other, but wanted fundamentally incompatible lives. Faith left that night. She packed a single bag with essentials, said goodbye to Eleanor with tears in both their eyes, and walked out of the compound that had been her home for 18 months. Lee didn't try to stop her, but she felt his eyes on her back as she left, heavy with everything unsaid. She'd saved money, hundreds of thousands from her work with Lee's organization, blood money in many ways, but money that would give her options and time to rebuild. She rented a small apartment in a different neighborhood, far from the compound, far from the world she'd inhabited. For the first week, Faith did nothing. She slept inconsistently, her body still programmed for constant vigilance. She ate little. She watched the news and saw reports of drug seizures, gang violence, criminal investigations, all the things she'd been part of creating or preventing or strategizing around. The world looked different now that she wasn't inside it, more complicated and less controllable. In the second week, Faith started volunteering at a free clinic in one of Lagos's poorest neighborhoods. It was small, understaffed, desperate for medical professionals. She worked long shifts treating malnutrition, infections, injuries from violence or accidents. Real medicine, healing instead of harm. It felt like coming home to a house that had been abandoned too long, familiar but changed, comfortable but requiring work to make livable again. Dr. Amara Okafor, the clinic director, was a woman in her 60s who dedicated her life to serving the poor. She accepted Faith's help gratefully, asking few questions about the gap in her employment history or why someone with Faith's clear expertise was volunteering rather than seeking paid positions. "We're grateful to have you," Dr. Okafor said, after Faith's first week, watching her stitch up a child's laceration with practiced skill. "You're clearly experienced, very competent. Where did you train?" "Various places," Faith said vaguely. "I've worked emergency medicine, trauma, internal medicine. And now you're here working for free in a clinic that can barely afford bandages." Dr. Okafor's eyes were shrewd. Running from something or toward something? Faith's hands paused briefly before continuing the suturing. "Maybe both." "Well, whatever brought you here, we need you. And these people need you." Dr. Okafor gestured to the crowded waiting room filled with patients who couldn't afford private care, who came to the free clinic as their only medical option. "Real healing happens here, not in fancy hospitals with expensive equipment, but here with people who have nothing except their hope that someone will help." Faith finished the suturing, bandaged the wound carefully, and gave the child's mother instructions for care. As they left, thanking her profusely, Faith felt something shift inside, a small piece of herself clicking back into place. This was who she'd been meant to be. This was the oath she'd taken, to heal, to help, to serve those most in need. But even as she found purpose in the clinic work, Faith couldn't escape what she'd become. The violence she'd participated in, the strategies she'd developed, the moral compromises she'd made. They were part of her now. She couldn't unknow the things she knew, couldn't unbecome the person she'd been. One night, 3 weeks after leaving the compound, Faith was working late at the clinic when 3 young men entered. They were clearly gang members, territory markers tattooed on their arms, weapons poorly concealed under their clothes. One was bleeding from a knife wound in his side. "Fix him," the leader demanded, his voice aggressive, "and keep your mouth shut about it." Faith's old instincts screamed warnings. These were the kind of men Lee's organization dealt with, small-time criminals, violent and unpredictable. Helping them could draw her back into the world she'd escaped. Refusing them could endanger the clinic, Dr. Okafor, the patients they served. She made her decision quickly. "Put him on the examination table," Faith said calmly, pulling on gloves. "And put your weapons away. This is a medical facility, not a battlefield." The leader hesitated, then nodded to his companions. They put their guns on a counter, watching Faith suspiciously as she examined the wounded man. The knife wound was serious but not fatal. Deep laceration, significant bleeding, but no apparent organ damage. Faith cleaned it, sutured carefully, gave antibiotics and pain medication. Standard emergency medicine. "You're good," the wounded man said, watching her work. "Real good. Where'd you learn to do this?" "Medical school. Years of practice." Faith finished the bandaging. "Come back in 3 days so I can check for infection, and try not to get stabbed again in the meantime." The leader stepped forward, pulling money from his pocket. "How much?" "Nothing. This is a free clinic. We don't charge patients." "Nah, you did good work. You should get paid." He tried to hand her a stack of bills, probably stolen, probably dirty money from whatever criminal enterprise they ran. "I said no charge." Faith's voice was firm. "But I need something from you instead." The men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. "This clinic serves this neighborhood. We treat anyone who needs help, no questions asked. We're neutral ground. I need your word that you'll spread that message. This place is off limits for violence, for recruitment, for anything except medical care. Can you give me that?" The leader studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out what kind of game she was playing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah, we can do that. Neutral ground. I'll spread the word." As they left, Dr. Okafor emerged from where she'd been hiding in the back office, her face pale. "Faith, those were dangerous men, armed criminals. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't." Faith cleaned up her supplies methodically. "And now this clinic has protection, or at least acknowledgement from one local gang that we're neutral territory." "How did you know to do that? How did you know they'd agree?" "Because I've negotiated with worse. Because I understand how these organizations work, how respect functions in violent hierarchies, how to project confidence when you're terrified." "Instinct," Faith said instead. "Just instinct." But it wasn't instinct. It was experience gained in Lee's world. She might have left the compound, might have rejected that life, but it had left marks on her. She'd been changed by her time there in ways she couldn't undo. That night, lying in her small apartment, Faith finally allowed herself to cry. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. She cried for the person she'd been before Lee. Naive, maybe, but whole. She cried for the person she'd become with Lee. Powerful, maybe, but fractured. She cried for the impossibility of going back or moving forward without carrying all of it with her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lee. His first communication since she'd left 4 weeks ago. "I heard about the clinic incident. You handled it perfectly. Stay safe. I love you." Faith stared at the message for a long time. He was having her watched, protected from a distance. Part of her was angry at the invasion of privacy. Part of her was relieved that his love wasn't conditional on her staying in his world. She typed a response, deleted it, typed again. "Thank you. Please stop watching. I need to do this alone." His response came immediately. "I can't stop caring, but I'll respect your space. The offer stands. Anything you need, always." Faith set the phone down without responding. Because what could she say? That she missed him but not the life he represented? That she loved him but couldn't be who she'd become with him? That she was grateful but also angry, relieved but also trapped by the complicated knot of feelings she couldn't untangle? Act 3. The Woman Who Remained. 3 months after leaving Lee's compound, Faith had established a routine. She worked at the free clinic 4 days a week, long shifts, treating the endless stream of patients who came seeking help they couldn't afford elsewhere. She volunteered with a community health initiative teaching basic first aid and disease prevention. She spent her free time reading, walking, trying to remember who she'd been before survival became her only goal. The work was exhausting but meaningful. Real healing, direct impact. She treated children with pneumonia, elders with untreated diabetes, women with birth complications who couldn't access hospitals. Every life saved felt like a small redemption for the lives she'd helped destroy during her time with Lee. But redemption wasn't simple. It wasn't a transaction where good deeds canceled out bad ones, where enough volunteer hours at a free clinic erased strategic planning for criminal organizations. The weight remained, heavy on her shoulders, present in every quiet moment. Dr. O'Coffer noticed, of course. She was too perceptive not to see the shadows that haunted Faith despite her competent work. "You carry something heavy," the older woman said one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly difficult shift. A young man had died, despite their efforts. Drug overdose, his body too damaged by long-term abuse to recover even with aggressive intervention. "Don't we all?" Faith replied, avoiding the real question. "Yes, but your weight is different, newer, the kind that comes from choices made recently, still raw enough to hurt rather than just ache." Dr. O'Coffer paused in her cleaning. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." Then, because she owed this woman honesty, "Maybe. I don't know. I spent 10 years working for a pharmaceutical company before coming here," Dr. O'Coffer said, surprising Faith. "Good salary, comfortable life, important research. But the company was testing drugs in ways that violated protocols, prioritizing profit over patient safety. I knew about it. I saw the data, understood the risks they were hiding from regulators. What did you do? Initially, nothing. I told myself I was just one person, that speaking up would destroy my career, that someone else would handle it." Dr. O'Coffer's voice was heavy with old regret. "Then a trial participant died. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her, taking experimental medication she believed was safe because my company lied about the risks. I'd seen the warnings in the data. I could have stopped it." Faith set down the supplies she was organizing. "What happened?" "I reported everything to the regulatory authorities. The company was investigated, shut down, executives prosecuted. My career in pharmaceutical research ended immediately. No one would hire the whistleblower. I lost my savings in legal battles." Dr. O'Coffer smiled sadly, "But I could look at myself in the mirror again. I could sleep without seeing that young woman's face every time I closed my eyes. And now you're here, working for free, treating people who can barely thank you properly?" "Yes, and I've never been happier, never felt more useful, never been more certain that my life has purpose and meaning." Dr. O'Coffer looked at Faith directly. "Whatever you did, whoever you worked for, you left. That matters. The question isn't whether you can erase the past. You can't. The question is what you build going forward." Faith felt tears welling up. "What if what I did is unforgivable? What if the harm I caused can't be balanced by the good I do now?" "Then you do the good anyway," Dr. O'Coffer said firmly, "not to earn forgiveness or redemption, just because it needs doing, because people need help and you have skills to offer, because choosing to heal instead of harm matters, even if it doesn't erase the harm you've already done." That conversation stayed with Faith, working its way through her thoughts like medicine slowly taking effect. She couldn't erase her time with Lee, couldn't undo the strategic plans that had led to deaths and destroyed organizations, couldn't reclaim the moral purity she'd once possessed, but she could choose differently going forward. Could use her skills to heal rather than harm, could build something meaningful from the wreckage of who she'd been. It wasn't redemption, exactly. It was something more modest and more achievable. Acceptance. Accepting that she'd made terrible choices for complicated reasons. Accepting that she was a flawed person trying to do better. Accepting that perfect purity was impossible, but meaningful work was still available. 4 months after leaving the compound, Faith received an unexpected visitor at the clinic. Eleanor appeared during the evening shift, looking out of place in her elegant clothes among the clinic's worn furniture and desperate patients. She waited patiently until Faith had finished treating a child's respiratory infection, then approached quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I needed to see you, to talk." They found a private corner of the clinic's small break room. Faith made tea, a gesture of hospitality that felt absurdly normal given their history. "How is he?" Faith asked, because she had to know, even though asking felt weakness. "Physically, recovered completely from the surgery. The organization is thriving, stronger than ever." Eleanor paused. "Emotionally?
He's heartbroken, though he'd never admit it. He misses you. We all do. Eleanor. Let me finish. The older woman's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not here to convince you to come back. Lee made me promise I wouldn't pressure you, that I'd respect your decision completely. I'm here because I wanted you to know what's happened since you left.
Faith listened as Eleanor described the 4 months she'd been gone. Lee had continued building the organization but had made significant changes. He'd cut ties with several operations that caused the most direct civilian harm. No more distribution in neighborhoods with high populations of children. No more involvement with operations that specifically targeted vulnerable populations. He'd established a fund, funded entirely through his illegal operations, laundering money into legitimate charitable work that supported clinics and schools in poor neighborhoods. It was a drop in the ocean compared to the harm his organization caused, a gesture that didn't come close to balancing the scales, but it was something, an acknowledgement that Faith's perspective had affected him. He's trying, Eleanor said softly, not to become legitimate. He can't do that without abandoning everyone who depends on him, leaving them vulnerable to rivals who have no moral boundaries whatsoever, but to minimize harm, to be slightly less terrible than the alternatives. That's a very low bar for morality, Faith said, echoing her previous conversation with Lee. Yes, but sometimes low bars are all we can reach. Eleanor looked at Faith directly. You changed him, Faith. Maybe not fundamentally, but meaningfully. He thinks about consequences now in ways he didn't before. He asks himself what you would say before making strategic decisions. That's your impact, your legacy from that time. A criminal who's slightly less terrible because of my influence. What a monument to my existence. It's more than most people achieve. Eleanor reached across, taking Faith's hand gently. You're doing important work here. Real healing. I can see it in your eyes. You're finding yourself again, piece by piece. Don't let guilt or regret steal that from you. After Eleanor left, Faith sat in the empty break room thinking about legacy and impact and the complicated ways people affected each other. She'd changed Lee, apparently, made him slightly more conscious of the harm he caused, slightly more likely to minimize suffering where possible. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't absolution, but it was something, and maybe something was enough. 6 months after leaving the compound, Faith's phone rang late at night, an unknown number like that first call that had changed her life 18 months before. She almost didn't answer. Almost. Faith Lewis. It was Marcus Kim, Lee's second in command. His voice was tight with controlled panic. We need you. Lee's been shot. Bad. Dr. Malhotra is unavailable. He's in South Africa for another surgery. Lee is bleeding out. We have maybe an hour, maybe less. Please. Faith's hands went cold. Take him to a hospital. He can't. There's an active warrant out. The police are looking for him. If we take him to a hospital, he gets arrested and dies in custody or from assassins Victor Park's allies sent. We need you. Marcus, I left that life. I can't. He's going to die, Faith. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Whatever you feel about him, about us, about what we do, he's a human being who saved your life once, who loved you completely. Please, just save him. Then you can leave forever and will never contact you again. Faith closed her eyes, feeling the terrible weight of the decision crushing her. She could refuse, could stay in her small apartment, keep her moral distance from that world, let Lee face the consequences of the life he'd chosen, or she could go, could save a life because saving lives was what she did, regardless of who needed saving, could face her past directly instead of hiding from it. Text me the address, she said finally. I'm coming. She grabbed her medical bag. She'd kept it packed, some part of her always prepared for emergencies even in her new life. She took a taxi to the address Marcus provided, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Inside, she found chaos. Lee was on a table, blood pooling beneath him, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Multiple gunshot wounds, chest, abdomen, leg. catastrophic injuries. He should have been dead already. Faith didn't think, didn't question, just moved into emergency mode, her training taking over completely. I need light, all the light you can get. I need clean water, bandages, IV supplies, and antibiotics. Her voice was commanding, cutting through the panic. Move, now. She worked for 3 hours straight, her hands steady despite the impossible circumstances. Chest tube to relieve tension pneumothorax, packing multiple wounds to control bleeding, IV lines for aggressive fluid resuscitation, antibiotics to prevent infection. Every skill she'd ever learned, every technique she'd practiced, all focused on keeping this man alive despite the odds that said he should die. Around her, Lee's men watched in awed silence as she worked. This was who she'd been trained to be, a healer who didn't give up, who fought death with science and skill and sheer determination.
Lee remained unconscious throughout. Faith was grateful for that. She couldn't have looked him in the eyes while working to save his life, couldn't have faced the complicated feelings that would have stirred up. Finally, at dawn, she stepped back from the table. Lee's vitals were stable. He was still critical, would need extensive recovery and probably additional surgery, but he would live. Against all odds, despite the severity of his injuries, he would survive. "He needs a hospital," Faith said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Real hospital care, with proper equipment and monitoring. I've stabilized him, but he needs more than I can provide here." "We have arrangement," Marcus said quietly. "Private facility, no questions asked." "Thank you, Faith. You saved his life." "I'm a nurse. It's what I do." Faith began cleaning up, packing her supplies mechanically. "But Marcus, this doesn't change anything. I saved his life because he deserved medical care, not because I'm coming back to that world. You understand?" "I understand," Marcus hesitated. "For what it's worth, he never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd find whatever peace you were looking for." Faith nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She left quickly, before Lee could wake, before she had to face him and all the complicated feelings his presence invoked. In the taxi home, as dawn light painted Lagos in soft golds, Faith finally let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing during the emergency. Love for Lee, still there, still real, despite everything. Grief for what they'd lost. Relief that he was alive. Fear about what came next. But underneath all of that, something else. Something unexpected. Pride. She'd saved a life tonight. Had used her skills exactly as they were meant to be used, to fight death, to preserve life, to heal. It didn't erase the harm she'd done during her time with Lee's organization, didn't balance scales that couldn't be balanced, but it reminded her who she was at her core. Not Faith, the strategic advisor to criminals, not Faith, the reluctant accomplice to violence, just Faith, the nurse, who saved lives because that's what nurses did. That woman had been buried for a while, hidden under layers of moral compromise and survival calculations. But she wasn't dead. She remained, persistent and resilient, waiting to be reclaimed. Over the following weeks, Faith heard nothing from Lee or his organization. True to Marcus's word, they left her alone completely. She heard through news reports that Lee had survived, that his organization continued operations, that life in Lagos's criminal underworld went on as it always had. She continued her work at the free clinic, her volunteer efforts with community health initiatives, her slow reconstruction of a life built on healing rather than harm. It wasn't easy. Some days she questioned whether she was making any real difference, whether her small acts of healing could ever balance the larger harm she'd been complicit in. But Dr. Okafor's words stayed with her. You do the good anyway, not to earn forgiveness or redemption, just because it needs doing. 8 months after leaving Lee's compound, Faith received a letter. Not a phone call or text, but an actual physical letter delivered to the clinic in an envelope that smelled faintly of expensive cologne. Inside, Lee's distinctive handwriting. Faith, I'm not writing to ask you to come back. I respect your choice completely and will honor it always. I'm writing because I wanted you to know what your time with me meant. You didn't just save my life.
twice now. You showed me that I could be something more than just a survivor, more than just a man reacting to threats and opportunities. You challenged me to think about the impact of my choices, to minimize harm where possible, to be intentionally better even if I couldn't be completely good. That's your legacy. Not just the lives you saved directly, but the change you inspired in someone who thought he was beyond changing. I love you still. I will always love you, but I release you from any obligation to that love. Be well, be whole, be the healer you were always meant to be. The world needs Faith the nurse more than it needs anyone involved in my world. L. Faith read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. It was a release, a blessing, a recognition that sometimes love meant letting go rather than holding on. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her bag, not to forget. She would never forget Lee or her time in his world, but to acknowledge and move forward. That evening, working late at the clinic, Faith treated a young woman who'd been beaten by her partner. The woman's injuries weren't life-threatening, bruises, a black eye, sprained wrist, but her spirit was broken, her confidence shattered. "I can't leave him," the woman whispered as Faith bandaged her wrist. "I have nowhere to go. No money, no support." Faith looked at her, really looked at her, and saw herself, not the physical similarities, but the spiritual ones. A woman trapped by circumstances, believing she had no choices, that survival required accepting unacceptable situations. "You have options," Faith said firmly. "They might not be easy options, and they might require courage you're not sure you have, but they exist. I can connect you with shelters, with legal assistance, with resources that can help you build a life outside of that relationship. But I love him." "I know. Love doesn't make staying the right choice. Sometimes love means saving yourself even when it hurts." Faith pulled out resources she'd been collecting. Shelter information, legal aid contacts, support groups. "Take these. You don't have to decide tonight, but when you're ready to choose yourself, these resources will help." The woman took the papers with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "How do you know? How do you know I can survive without him?" Faith smiled sadly. "Because I did it. I walked away from someone I loved because staying was destroying me. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I survived, and so can you." As the woman left with the resources and a follow-up appointment, Faith felt something shift inside her, a final piece clicking into place. She'd been so focused on redemption, on erasing her past, on balancing scales that couldn't be balanced. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was simply this: choosing differently going forward, using her experiences, all of them, even the darkest ones, to help others find their own paths forward. Being someone who understood complicated choices and difficult circumstances without judgment, who could offer support without requiring perfection. She would never be purely good. That ship had sailed the moment she got in that black Mercedes 18 months ago, but she could be honestly flawed. Someone who'd made terrible mistakes and was trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to do better. That was enough. It had to be enough. 2 years after leaving Lee Min-ho's compound, Faith Lewis stood in her office at the expanded free clinic, reviewing the month's patient statistics. They'd treated over 3,000 patients that month, 3,000 people who received medical care they couldn't afford elsewhere, who were treated with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances or ability to pay. Dr. O'Fokker had retired 6 months ago, leaving Faith as the clinic director. It was work Faith loved: healing and administration, direct patient care, and strategic planning, using all her skills in service of something genuinely good. She'd even started teaching, training young medical students and nurses, sharing her extensive emergency medicine expertise, preparing the next generation of healers. When she taught about trauma care, she drew on experiences from both her conventional medical training and her time treating gunshot wounds in Lee's world. She didn't share the specifics, but the knowledge was there, making her instruction comprehensive in ways that theoretical training never could be. Faith had relationships again. real friendships with her colleagues, connections with community members, a social life beyond just survival and work. She dated occasionally, though nothing serious had developed. She was learning to be alone without being lonely, to find value in herself that didn't depend on someone else seeing her worth. She heard about Lee sometimes, through news reports or community gossip. His organization still operated, still controlled significant criminal territory in Lagos, but there were rumors of changes. Slightly fewer civilian casualties, slightly more community investment, slightly less terrible than the alternatives. Was that Faith's influence, or just Lee's natural evolution? She didn't know, couldn't know, but she hoped she'd left some mark, some reminder that choices mattered even in impossible circumstances. Occasionally, very occasionally, she allowed herself to remember their time together. The good parts, how he'd made her feel valued and powerful, how they'd been partners in ways she'd never experienced before, how his love had been genuine even if the context was impossible, and the hard parts, the violence she'd been complicit in, the compromises she'd made, the person she had to become to survive in his world. She didn't regret leaving, but she didn't regret the time there entirely either. It had broken her and remade her, shown her capabilities she'd never known she possessed, taught her about the complicated spaces between pure good and pure evil where most human life actually occurred. Faith's phone buzzed, a call from the main clinic desk. "Dr. Lewis, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Faith headed to the waiting room, expecting another crisis, another emergency. Instead, she found a young woman holding a toddler, both healthy and well cared for. "Dr. Lewis?" The woman's face was hesitant but hopeful. "You probably don't remember me. I came here 2 years ago. You treated my wrist after my partner hit me. You gave me resources, told me I could survive without him." Faith remembered. The woman's tears, her broken spirit, how she'd seen herself in that pain. "I remember," Faith said gently. "How are you?" "I'm good, really good." The woman's smile was genuine, transforming her face. "I left him that night. Went to the shelter you recommended, got legal help, filed for a protection order, started therapy. It was hard, so hard, but I survived. I got a job, an apartment, built a life. This is my daughter." She kissed the toddler's head. "I wanted to thank you. You saved my life that night, not by treating my injuries, but by showing me I had choices." Faith felt tears prickling her eyes. "You saved yourself. I just pointed toward resources that were available. No, you did more than that. You saw me as human when I felt worthless. You believed I could survive when I thought I was trapped forever." The woman reached out, squeezing Faith's hand. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." After they left, Faith stood in the waiting room, feeling something profound settle over her. This was redemption, not erasing the past, but building something meaningful from the wreckage, not balancing scales that couldn't be balanced, but choosing healing over harm, day after day, patient after patient. She would never be purely good, would always carry the weight of what she'd done during her time with Lee, would always wonder if she could have chosen differently, made better decisions, found another path. But she was here now, doing work that mattered, helping people who needed help, using her skills, all of them, including the dark ones learned in Lee's world, in service of healing rather than harm. That woman who'd gotten in the black Mercedes 2 years ago, desperate, angry, seeking escape, she was gone, dead in the ways that mattered, but from her ashes had risen someone new, someone harder and softer at once, someone who understood that morality was complicated, that people made impossible choices in difficult circumstances, that redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction. Faith Lewis, 45 years old, clinic director, healer, survivor, flawed and trying, broken and rebuilding, human in all the messy, complicated ways that humanity actually worked. She went back to her office, back to the patient files and administrative work and strategic planning, the same skills she'd used in Lee's world, now deployed for healing instead of harm. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever: peace. Not the peace of innocence, That was gone, irretrievable, but the peace of acceptance, of knowing who she was, what she'd done, what she was building now, of understanding that she could live with herself, could look in the mirror and see someone genuinely trying to do better. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd imagined that first night in Lee's compound. It was better, because it was real, earned through suffering and choice and slow, painful growth. Faith Lewis had been broken by life, remade herself in a criminal's world, and finally rebuilt into something honest and useful. Not perfect, never perfect, but genuine, trying, healing. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The end.